House of Representatives today began debating severe spending cuts proposed by the Republican majority. NewsHour congressional correspondent Kwame Holman has our story.
By putting the issue of spending front and center, House Republicans were sending a clear message on the eve of the president's State of the Union address. Their effort today was to instruct the Budget Committee to reduce non-security spending to pre-2008 levels, which would save $84 billion. California's David Dreyer.
Time for us to exercise our power of the purse. Restraint is long, long overdue. We must return to pre-bailout, pre-binge spending levels for funding the federal government. We know that a great deal of hard work and tough decisions lie ahead for every single member of this institution.
Programs that could be particularly hard hit include Amtrak Passenger Rail, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Even with those cuts, the federal budget deficit is expected to top $1 trillion this year. Democrats, meanwhile, argued broad cuts would have serious consequences. Oregon's Peter DeFazio.
If we were only going to get to a balanced budget this year with cuts, that would mean eliminating the entire government of the United States of America. We'd still make our Social Security payments, and we wouldn't be able to exempt the Pentagon, which they want to do if we wanted to really get to $1.6 trillion. No more border patrol, no more Homeland Security, no more Coast Guard, no more Postal Service, no more Centers for Disease Control. Department of Education, gone. They wouldn't care much about that. Park Service, I guess, would probably sell off the parks at the highest bidder. I don't know.
Federal spending also dominated the conversation on the Sunday political talk shows. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell urged the president to focus on cutting the size of government, not growing it.
I think excessive government spending, running up debt, making us look like a Western European country is the wrong direction. That's the direction they took the first 2 years. The American public, as one pundit put it, issued a massive restraining order, and I don't think we're going to go in that direction any longer.
But not all Republicans appear to be on the same page with what to cut. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor said everything was on the table, including defense spending. That put him at odds with a group of GOP lawmakers who said last week such cuts should be off limits.
I can tell you, we've always said this, too. Every dollar should be on the table. And I've said before...
Including defense cuts?
Absolutely. I've said before, no one can defend the expenditure of every dollar and cent over the Pentagon.
For his part, the president was short on specifics this weekend. In a videotaped message emailed to supporters previewing tomorrow night's speech, he stuck to broad themes such as competitiveness, job creation, and responsible deficit reduction.
My principal focus, my number one focus, is going to be making sure that we are competitive, that we are growing, and we are creating jobs, not just now, but well into the future. I'm focused on making sure that the economy is working for everybody, for the entire American family. We're also going to have to deal with our deficits and our debt in a responsible way. And we've got to reform government so that it's leaner and smarter for the 21st century.
At the White House today, Press Secretary Robert Gibbs told reporters they wouldn't be getting any more from him.
We're not going to have a debate in Washington about whether we need to make some changes and whether we need to control our spending. We're going to have, hopefully, a bipartisan discussion and work together on how we go about doing that.
That discussion will begin in earnest in mid-February when the president unveils his budget for the coming fiscal year.
Jeffrey Brown has more on the big decisions to come on spending and cutting.
And for that, we turn to Robert Greenstein, Executive Director of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a policy organization that advocates on behalf of lower-income families. And Chris Edwards is Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, which is dedicated to free markets and limited government. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, Chris Edwards, we don't have specifics yet, do we? So as a starting point, how hard or easy would it be to do what the Republicans are talking about this year?
Well, the Republicans are off to a good start. They promised to
reduce spending on domestic programs back to 2008 levels. What that means is this. Spending on these domestic programs has roughly doubled since 2000, from about $280 billion a decade ago to about $550 billion today. Republicans want to take about $100 billion out of that. That seems like a good start to me. I wish they would include defense cuts, and they've also got to tackle entitlements.
But how hard or easy? Same question to you.
Very hard. We're talking about $100 billion that doesn't include any changes in the Pentagon. It rules out any of the spending or the subsidies that are in the tax code through special interest tax loopholes. The $100 billion would have to come entirely from things like elementary and secondary education, aid to help college students afford college, protecting food safety, air traffic control, all of these sorts of things, law enforcement, protecting the borders. And to get $100 billion now, when a number of the months of the fiscal year are already gone, it would mean all those things get cut by a third. Overnight, you're cutting the cancer research by a third, services for disabled, frail elderly by a third. Now, if you didn't want to cut some things by a third, fine. Then you'd have to cut other things by two-thirds. These would be the most severe cuts in these kinds of programs in American history. And by coming right now while the economy is really weak, yeah, we need spending restraint when the economy recovers. You do it right now, you will lose hundreds of thousands of jobs because you're pulling out money from the economy. You'll have less sales in the private sector.
All right, let's come back to that bigger question about the economy and the timing here. But when you listen to that list, what is your reaction? That's a good list, or that?
I think just about all those cuts would be good, and I would add in farm subsidies, $25 billion a year. This is sort of we tax average people to fund rich farm corporations. Energy subsidies, again, these are business subsidies that go to big corporations. The federal government does all this stuff funding local governments, like $10 billion a year on public housing and urban transit. This sort of stuff. That stuff isn't really federal responsibility. So I'd say get the government out of business subsidies, get the government out of funding properly local activities.
And the consequences of making such big cuts in such a quick amount of time?
I think we'd have a better government here in the United States. I think running these trillion-dollar deficits is extremely damaging to the economy. It's really unsettling financial markets. All these basic investments like air traffic control, we can do in the private sector. I mean, Canada has a private air traffic control system. So I don't, cutting air traffic control would be a good thing in my view.
Mr. Greenstein.
I agree with Chris that it would be good to rein in farm subsidies and business subsidies. Under the Republican proposal, you're not allowed to get any of the $100 billion in cuts from either of those areas. Farm subsidies are an entitlement, separate part of the budget. Most of the business subsidies are coming through tax breaks in the tax code, separate part of the budget. So we're talking about really very large cuts overnight. And we should keep in mind that the part of the budget they want to take $100 billion out of, 1/3 of that part of the budget is federal grants to state and local governments. They already have huge budget holes.
So it would fall on them, you're saying?
It would fall on them. They'd fire even more teachers. They'd cut back fire and police even more at the local level.
All right, what about that? There's a specific point. Would it be thrown on to states and local governments that don't have any money?
I think the federal government should cut all these state and local activities. Then it would be up to each state, how big they want to fund these programs. So the federal government spends $60 billion on K-12 education. In my view, federal involvement in the schools has not helped test scores. It hasn't helped American students. And again, let's look at a foreign example. Canada has no federal Department of Education, and yet their kids do much better on international tests than do American kids. So I don't think federal involvement in these local activities is the answer.
Do you think we're making it's partly economics and partly politics here, of course, inescapably, right?
Right.
When you get to all this list that you've both been talking about, what happens politically? Isn't that always somebody's sacred cow, or somebody? Some representative represents these things.
You're absolutely right. Every single federal spending program has special interest groups that support it, and there is some heavy lifting involved in spending cuts. I wish the Republicans would come out and give us more specifics. So far, as we've seen, Republican leaders have been very shy about telling us exactly where they would want to cut. And we don't know whether they're going to be cutting across the board or cutting these specific programs. Certainly,
I think we need to get the federal government out of areas like K-12 education. The federal government simply doesn't have the money anymore to fund these local activities, and that's the message Republicans should be giving here.
But you think, Bob Greenstein, it's no accident that we haven't heard specifics yet from either side?
It's no accident because once it's a campaign pledge. Cut spending with a capital S. There is no spending with a capital S that's a program. There are things like education and child care and protecting the borders, and they're afraid to actually put the specifics on the table. In terms of Chris's point about state and local governments, they're flat on their back now because of the downturn. What are they going to do? Double tax rates to make up for a withdrawal of federal funding from education? I mean, this is really not something.
But I mean, the federal government doesn't have any magic source of funds. I mean, the funds for federal programs eventually come from the taxpayers that live in the 50 states. So there's no magical source of funds here. We've got taxpayers have to pay for all of this spending.
There's something surreal about our having just extended a tax cut that provides an average tax cut of $125,000 a year to each person who makes over $1 million a year. Somehow we could afford massive tax cuts for the wealthiest people in the country, but we have to slash K-12 education, air traffic control, clean air and water, cancer research.
Let me come back to one other, the issue you raised at the beginning, the larger issue, that this is the exact wrong time to be making cuts of this sort, whether we need to down the line or not, right? But in a lousy economy, the argument is we need to be spending more, not cutting less.
I think that's backward Keynesian economics. We've had deficit spending of $1 trillion a year the last 3 years, and look at where it's got us. We still got almost 10% unemployment. So I don't think the idea of big government spending has solved our economic problems. I think, like Britain now, we need to have a spending cut package put in place. We need to start reducing these deficits. We need to get the federal government out of the private sector so that the private sector can start growing again. The government won't make the economy grow again. Ultimately, it's got to be private business people feeling comfortable with the economic picture to start investing again.
All right, and a brief last
answer.
Well,
I think the key economic studies show if we hadn't done what we've done in the last 2 years, unemployment would probably be about 12 or 13% now. And if you want to make an analogy with Great Britain, even after all the cuts they're doing, they will have government at 40% of their gross domestic product. They have a much bigger public sector than we do, and even after they do all their cuts, they'll have a bigger public sector than we do before we make any cuts. So the analogy doesn't really work there.
All right, beginning of a big argument here in Washington. Bob Greenstein, Chris Edwards, thank you both very much.
Thank you.